Welcome to Leadership Lessons from the Fast Lane, brought to you by the Washington Speakers Bureau. In this space, we will explore some of the most pressing challenges that leaders face today with the world's most respected, innovative, curious, and accomplished thought leaders. We'd like to welcome our host, best-selling author and co-author of the recently published book, Choose Love, Not Fear, a WSB exclusive speaker for almost 30 years, Gary Heil.
Welcome to Leadership Lessons from the Fast Lane. My name is Gary Heil. Our guest today is an American icon, Admiral Bill McRaven. He spent 37 years as a naval officer in the SEALs and retired as Commander of Special Operations Command, where he was actively involved in the rescue of Captain Phillips, the arrest of Saddam Hussein, and the capturing of Osama bin Laden. After he retired from the Navy, he took a small job as the Chancellor of the University of Texas, where he oversaw 14 institutions, 220,000 students, 20,000 faculty, and more than 85,000 healthcare workers and researchers. After he retired from Texas, he wrote a couple bestsellers, gave one of the best speeches ever given in American oratory, and along the way picked up a number of national and international awards for promoting democracy and for outstanding service to our nation. We are honored today to have you, Bill. Thank you for sharing some time with us.
Very great to be here with you.
As we begin, Bill, I think we should start in the context of the environment we find ourselves in. Leaders today, this mid-COVID world that we're in, are being asked to innovate faster than they ever thought imaginable. They're being asked to adapt, to try and find ways to capture the advantages of the changes in what people are calling the new normal environment, which, as far as I can see, is far more new than normal. You've been an advocate your entire career for higher levels of innovation, more change, more adaptability. Bill, when you think about the world today and the decisions these leaders need to make that will define their futures, what advice might you have so that they might create a more innovative culture as they come out of this sequestered world they're in today?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think there is this misperception out there that, this new normal that we're in fact, is new, or for some reason abnormal in reality. The fact of the matter is, every generation gets challenged. Every leader in the course of, every job they're ever going to hold is going to get challenged. There's never going to be enough resources. They're always going to have to innovate. So I think as tragic as this COVID-19 is and the effect that it is having on our economy and the lives of so many families, from a leader standpoint, in every crisis there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity to kind of reassess your corporate structure, to reassess how you motivate people, to reassess your own leadership skills. And I think every leader understands no plan survives contact with the enemy, as we say in the military. The implication there is you can have the best plan, and then all of a sudden the enemy gets a vote. So if you are a big corporation like Amazon or Facebook, and then all of a sudden this happens, you're going to have to reconfigure how you go about doing business. If you're a small business, same thing applies. But frankly, whether it's personal or professional, everybody has to take a look at where they are. They're going to have to kind of build a plan for the future. They're going to have to take into consideration all the anomalies that are out there, make the best plan possible, inspire the people that work for them, manage through the plan, and get to the end state. This is no different, really, than any leader in any crisis at any time in history.
Bill, you've often said to me that, this idea of buying the gates, the idea of challenging the culture to become innovative by doing something ahead of time that forces us down a different path.
Yeah, this stems from an article I was reading many years ago when I was on a Southwest flight, flying I think back to Texas, and the flight talked about the CEO of Southwest Airlines, and this was the story was talking about 1987 when we had obviously the big crash. And a lot of people were, from the airline standpoint, they were looking at how they were going to sell off their gates. Because in order to gain capital, in order to have resources to be able to survive this economic downturn, they knew that they would have to sell the gates. Well, the CEO of Southwest Airlines at the time said, you know what, I'm going to kind of mortgage our future and I'm going to buy those gates. He saw an opportunity. He realized that he was going to have to assume a lot of risk, that he was going to have to take what capital they had and go buy the gates that the other airlines were selling off in anticipation and expectation that when the turn came, well, in fact, Southwest Airlines would be perfectly positioned to take advantage of now the upswing in the economy. And of course, that's exactly what happened, and Southwest Airlines has gone on to be one of the great airlines. And those companies that in fact tried to take all their capital and bring it back inside, the Easterns, the Braniffs, the TWAs, they didn't survive for very long.
But it's kind of interesting that he's taking the risk before he knows exactly what he's going to do with it. You know, Freud once said that the human being doesn't usually vote for complexity over simplicity. And we like certainty and we like comfort a lot more than we like discomfort. It takes a certain amount of courage, doesn't it, to make that decision and see around the corner and start down a path before you know where you're going exactly?
Yeah, of course it does. But I think that's what separates the kind of the good leaders from the great leaders. You know, the great leaders have this, I think, to some degree, an innate ability, or maybe it's an experiential ability because they've seen it before somewhere in their life, to realize that here is an opportunity, here is a chance to take some risk, sometimes great risk, sometimes moderate risk, sometimes a little bit of risk, but recognizing that nothing good happens unless you're prepared to take some risk. Does that require courage? Of course it does. It requires personal courage. It requires professional courage. You realize that you are putting your reputation out there, your company's reputation and survival out there. But I think what happens for the great leaders is it is a calculated risk. And I'm sure as Southwest Airlines looked at the potential downfalls of buying up the gates, concerns that, well, what if the economy doesn't come back in time for us to recapitalize? What if the economy doesn't come back in time for us to take advantage of this? Certainly, those are all risks. In the military, we take risks every day in combat, and those risks are pretty great because you're putting the lives of young men and women on the line. So you have to be thoughtful in your risks. You have to be calculated in your risk. You don't want your risk to be cavalier. And the difference between a cavalier risk and a calculated risk is in a cavalier risk, it's a little bit of a gut instinct. I'm just going to go with it. In a calculated risk, you think through it, you plan it, you look at what's going to happen if things don't go well, what's plan A, what's plan B, what's plan C, what's plan D, and then you do the best you can to reduce that risk to a manageable level. That's the difference between, again, great leaders who manage the risk and then the cavalier leaders who think their gut instinct alone will help them get through it.
And the imagination to see around those corners, do you find that there's a lot of that? The kind of imagination it takes to see what might go right, what might go wrong, what the world might look like in 6 or 8 months?
Yeah, I would offer that, you know, the number of leaders that can truly do that, I think, are few and far between. I've often said that, you know, you can teach men and women to be good leaders. In the military, we did it all the time. You take someone who has never had an opportunity to lead, you teach them the basics of leadership, you put them in positions of responsibility, you allow them to grow as a leader, and they can get to be very good leaders. I believe personally that the great leaders have something in their DNA that sets them apart from the good leaders. A lot of this has to do, I believe, with their ability to, you know, in kind of today's vernacular, they have an emotional quotient where they can understand and feel the company that they're working for. They can inspire people in ways that good leaders can't. I also believe the great leaders, to your point, they can see around those corners. I don't know how it's done. I'm not sure, you know, that you can teach that, but I have seen the great leaders that I have worked for be able to see opportunities in crisis that some other people didn't. And not only did they see that opportunity, they were prepared to take the risk, again, the professional risk and the personal risk, in hopes that their company, their corporation, their military unit would be better off as a result of their leadership through this crisis, through looking around the corner.
You know, when we had a conversation once before, we were talking about academy graduates like me being engineers, and you guys with these liberal arts degrees that didn't have to have all the answers in the beginning. To some extent, you think you had a natural advantage because of your education.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've worked for leaders that were engineers, and they were fabulous leaders because, again, they were able to, as great engineers do, as you take it from point A to point B. You are looking at every aspect of the engineering plan, and then I have worked for great leaders that are journalism majors and liberal arts majors that also have an ability to see opportunity in crisis. So I don't think it's necessarily a function of how you are wired, left brain, right brain, engineer, liberal arts. There's another component that's part of it, again, part of your DNA that just gives you a vision that separates the great leaders from the good leaders. I was talking about Herb Kelleher from Southwest Airlines. I don't know what Herb's background was, but he was one of these guys that could take the risks, had the swagger, had the confidence, but knew the airline industry very, very well as he went off and embarked on this opportunity to change Southwest Airlines.
Yeah, and there's something about the idea of needing an answer sometimes. There is this idea that I think we underestimate our needs for certainty in human beings, that it takes a leader's enthusiasm sometimes to push us off the cliff, to get us to embrace that discomfort that comes from that uncertainty. And that's sort of what you call sometimes the leader as salesman, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely true. And while I won't necessarily attribute great leadership skills to them, when you look at the great companies and you look at Steve Jobs and how he drove the engineers that worked for him to, let's put something in a package this big. And of course, the engineers pushed back and said, Steve, we can't do that. And he said, let me be clear about this. We are going to build this, this iPod that became the iPhone, that became this transformational piece of technology because Steve Jobs drove it. If you go back and read about Thomas Edison, I would say that Jobs had a lot of Edison in him. I mean, Edison was relentless in how he pursued some of his ideas. Not only was he brilliant, 1,500 patents in his lifetime, from obviously the light bulb to the phonograph to the movie picture, but he was relentless with the people that worked for him. He was relentless in his own personal habits, in forcing the company to push the boundaries. And so again, great leaders will do that. They will push the people that work for them. They will motivate the people that work for them. That doesn't always make them easy to work with, but in the end, if they're the right leaders for the right time, then you have these transformational technologies and transformational corporations and units.
No, I read an article a while ago where in the New York Times, they were documenting your reading list. I hardly can imagine a time when I felt less adequate than reading what you're reading. Tell me about your reading list.
Yeah, well, I guess the best way to describe it is eclectic. I have a lot of interests. The first thing I tell folks, though, is if I'm reading a novel, if I'm not immediately attached to the characters within the first 5 or 10 pages, I'll put the book down. I can't make my way through a novel unless it grabs me immediately. My wife, on the other hand, will read all the way to the bitter end, hoping that somehow the novel is going to come out with a unique ending that makes it satisfying. I'm not that way. But my nonfiction areas of interest, again, probably a bit eclectic. I like philosophy. So I tend to read a lot of Descartes. I tend to read a lot of Kant and Nietzsche. Interestingly enough, I happen to like poetry, and my novels tend to go towards either science fiction or a good mystery. So my nightstand is stacked with books. Some of them, again, are probably only 10 pages in. I may never pick them up again, and then some of them will be there for years as I continue every night to read a little bit here and there.
What becomes interesting to me with leaders is, regardless of what we read and what we don't read, there's a curiosity on the part of many great leaders that just never stops their passion for learning. There's a tendency as we get older to become more rigid and stuck in our ways, and avid learners who just don't believe they have answers, that continue to learn from everybody, are a different breed. But sometimes I think we think of learning as easier than it is. It can be anxiety provoking. It can be time consuming. How do you, in an organization, when you're helping to create that culture, how do you help instill that curiosity in others?
Yeah, instilling the curiosity in others. Back to your point about, does the leader have to be a bit of a salesman? I mean, I don't want that to sound pejorative, but yeah, I do think a leader has got to inspire people, and if that kind of connotes a salesmanship, probably rightfully so. So as a leader, if you have a vision for your company, your military unit, your university, you're going to have to inspire people, encourage people through your kind of personal outreach, and show them that the mission, the goals you're trying to achieve are noble and worthwhile and worth them investing their time, their energy into achieving that goal. So if they're not initially interested, if they're not initially curious, I think you can encourage them to be curious by inspiring them towards the end state. And that's, I think that's every leader's responsibility.
I guess there's a little leadership by example in there too.
It absolutely is leadership by example. If you can't just talk the talk, if you're not walking the walk, the rank and file know it. I mean, that's the first thing you learn in the military is, you certainly can't fool the troops. These are smart young men and women. They expect their leaders to be good. If you are not walking the walk after you get up there and try to inspire them, they're not going to follow you. And frankly, I think that's true in any organization.
I'm sure of that. One of the things that jumps off the page in our conversations is hope. Your word, hope. The idea that you're building confidence that tomorrow will be better than yesterday, and that it's interesting to talk about it, easy to talk about. But in a world that tends to be more fearful, more negative than it needs to be, how does a leader create a culture where hope is more prevalent?
Yeah, I think there's always this impression that hope, instilling hope in the troops and the rank and file, in your employees, is all about having motivational speeches. And I will tell you, that only takes you so far. What gives people hope is that you have a plan, and that you can articulate that plan, and that you can meet the milestones of that plan. I mentioned earlier, I'm reading the book The Splendid and the Vile, about Winston Churchill in the early years of the war. And of course, Churchill comes in as the prime minister. He is not well received by the king. The other members of parliament don't particularly care for Churchill. And very early on, of course, he is this great orator. He gets before the parliament. He makes these fabulous speeches. But what gave the British people hope, the folks in the United Kingdom hope, was the fact that Churchill had a plan. He knew he had to strike back against the Nazis. He had to deliver on his plan. And so every leader ought to recognize that it's more than about the rah-rah speeches. It's more than about just being a great orator. You have got to have a plan. You have got to, manage through that plan. You have got to show the people that work for you that you're making progress on that plan, and that at the end of the day, you are going to be successful. You will have setbacks. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. You are going to have setbacks, and if all of a sudden plan A doesn't work, and plan B doesn't work, and plan C and D don't work, and you get kicked in the gut, the last thing you want to do is feel sorry for yourself, go into your room and put your head between your hands. No, what you've got to do is you've got to come up with, the next part of the plan, get back on the horse, and show the people that are working for you that you can work through this crisis, you can work through this failure. They will have hope in you. They will be inspired by you, but you have got to deliver on the plan, or all the great speeches in the world won't encourage the people to follow you.
So it's preparation is a big part of that, creating hope, so that I'm prepared, right? Then
It is not only preparation, it's preparation and execution. I mean, I've seen a lot of folks that put a ton of work into a plan, and then we're not able to execute on the plan. Now, obviously, if you put a lot of planning and effort into a good plan, that's a great thing, but you have to be able to execute on the plan. If you can't do that, then people won't trust you, and they won't have hope in what you're trying to do.
There are a lot of good plans, right?
A lot of good plans.
All right. Tell me about Marcinko.
Dick Marcinko was one of these kind of great characters within the SEAL community. He was a Vietnam vet, highly decorated, a very charismatic officer. I had the opportunity to work for him in 1982-83 at a SEAL team, very elite SEAL team. And I actually liked Dick Marcinko. I thought he was, again, he was great about, he had this aura and this charisma about him, and people were attracted to him. But at the end of the day, he and I kind of didn't agree on how my job should be done, and he fired me. And it's never good to get fired. As I've told folks, it's particularly bad to be fired in the SEAL teams because everybody knows you've been fired. It's a small group, and so people try to be kind and gracious to you when that happens, and they pat you on the back and they shake your hand, but you know what they're thinking. They're wondering whether or not you're good enough to be one of their officers. So I had to go through that very challenging time in my own life back in 1983. Fortunately, there were some great officers that took a second chance on me, gave me an opportunity to get back up on the horse and show that I was a capable officer, and it ended up working out pretty well.
The interesting thing when you left, you had a choice, right? I mean, many people face these disruptions. They get fired, they get laid off, whatever it would be. And I think that's especially appropriate to think about today, given the unemployment rate and what's happened with this health crisis. But what you've said over and over again is that it's not so much what happens to you, because it's not fair. Most of the time it's not fair, and it's not just, and you probably deserve some part of it, not part of it. But at the end of the day, that's life, right? What matters, isn't it, is what you do next, not what happened to you yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all have a choice. I've told the story before about going through SEAL training. And when you go through SEAL training, the instructors, they're kind of like kings. I mean, whatever they say, you got to do. And, if they went to Oklahoma University and you went to the University of Texas, or if they're a Dodgers fan and, you're a Yankees fan, I don't care whatever it is, if they don't like you, they can tell you to hit it, and you go fully clothed, you run over the sand dunes, you jump in the ocean, you get soaking wet, you come back, you roll around in the sand, you're kind of covered head to toe in sand, you throw sand down your shirt, and the effect is called a sugar cookie. And the interesting thing about it is there were a lot of guys that just didn't understand the concept of the sugar cookie, because some of the guys would be first on the run, and they would still become a sugar cookie, and they would be first on the swim, and they'd be a sugar cookie, or they'd make the highest test grade on the dive physical or the dive exam, and they would still be a sugar cookie. And those guys wanted someone to pat them on the back. They wanted to say, great job, great work. And when that didn't happen, they didn't understand why all their hard work wasn't rewarded. And the lesson in SEAL training, and everything in SEAL training had a lesson to it. And the lesson in SEAL training at the time was, hey, life's not fair, get over it. And some guys had trouble getting over it. But the fact of the matter is, life isn't fair. Sometimes you get let go, sometimes you get fired, sometimes things just don't work out. Back to the choices. Yeah, you have two choices. You can decide that life is against you and life isn't fair, and you're going to buckle to that. Or you can decide that you're going to get your chin up, you're going to dust yourself off, and you're going to kind of proceed forward and make the best of it. And that's just what you have to do in life. We're all going to be sugar cookies at some point in time. Don't worry about it. Just keep moving forward.
Yeah, and people forget Steve Jobs was fired from that.
That's right.
And I have hardly ever met a leader, interested in your perspective, that didn't have some rough patch in their career where they had to make that choice to brood over it and go away, or to say, get up, dust yourself off, and let's play.
Yeah, I think that actually is what makes great leaders, is this understanding, because they have been there. To your point, Gary, I don't know of anybody that got to the top without falling a couple rungs on the ladder at some point in time. Because if you don't, then I don't know that you have steeled yourself appropriately enough to be able to make the decisions that a great leader is going to have to make. I don't know whether or not you can be empathetic enough to the people that work for you who when they fail, you understand how to motivate them and get them back up on the horse. So I don't know that you can be at the top of your game if you haven't had one or two falls from grace and figured out how to resolve it and get moving forward. Bring yourself together and be successful again.
Could it be that this health crisis is providing a an opportunity for many people who have fell in tough times here or been laid off or have been challenged to take a look in the mirror and say, what will I do next?
You bet. I mean, this kind of global crisis that we're dealing with, it's global, but the fact of the matter is, it's very, very personal. I mean, it comes down to individuals as well as it does to the world. So, yeah, people are always going to have to be reassessing, and this is the nature of life. Every day, you're probably reassessing whether or not you're doing the right thing, whether you're doing it correctly, whether you're on the right path. When you have a crisis like this, I just think it compresses that somewhat in terms of, sometimes you have, weeks and months and years to assess where you are. When a crisis happens and it compresses that timeline and you have to assess your viability every single day, actually, I think there is some benefit to that, and it may put you on the right path faster than had you not been in a crisis.
Sort of a personal necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly right.
Bill, tell me about accountability. I've never met a great leader yet that doesn't have a culture of knee-knocking accountability, sort of you got to execute.
Accountability really is probably the cornerstone, or certainly one of the four cornerstones in a building to great leadership, to great units. There's a wonderful book written by a fellow named John Baines, hard to find. It's called Morale, just like it sounds. And Baines, in the course of the book, goes back and looks at a unit in the British Army back in early 1900s, 1914, called the 5th Scottish Rifles. And the 5th Scottish Rifles were determined to be one of the worst units in the British Army at the time. And the reason they were determined to be bad was because, frankly, everybody was treated the same. There were not high standards. No one was held accountable for their poor work. The guys that were busting their hump were treated just like the slackers. New commanding officer comes in and says, hey, boys, here's what we're going to do. Here are the new standards, and I'm going to hold everybody accountable. You're either going to achieve those standards or you're not going to be in this unit. And the unit and the men in the unit rose to the occasion. And in fact, in 1915, at the Battle of Neuve Chapelle, they were one of the most decorated units in the British Army. And the reason that's important is it really is about accountability. Every leader needs to understand that people want to be part of a great organization. I don't know anybody out there. I don't care whether you're flipping burgers someplace. You want to be the best burger flipper you can. But most people come into an organization and they want to be part of a great organization. Nobody says, where's that mediocre organization? That's what I want to be. I want to be part of that mediocre organization. Of course not. You want to be part of a great organization. How do you be part of a great organization? The leader sets high standards. The leader gives you the resources to achieve those standards. And then they hold you accountable if you fail to do that. And when that happens, when the rank and file know that you're going to set high standards and that you are going to hold people accountable, you will be surprised at how the men and women that work for you will rise to the occasion and do the job the way you hoped and expected they would do it. But if you have no accountability, if everybody is treated equally, whether they work hard or whether they're slackers, then you'll never get there.
For sure. And one of the things that we're often asked, and I think is difficult for some people to comprehend, is the idea that I could be a hopeful organization full of positivity and want people to reach their potential, and yet have knee-knocking accountability that says, I have to let you go, or I have to hold you accountable. And you're saying, but you're positive.
Yeah, accountability doesn't mean being draconian. It doesn't mean not having compassion. I think what the great leaders do is they hold people accountable. That doesn't mean they rip them apart and and destroy the morale over one opportunity to hold somebody accountable. I always found that the great leaders I worked with found unique ways to hold, in my case, the men that worked in the unit accountable, and to allow them to understand why they were short in achieving the goal, but without hurting their personal morale and keeping them motivated. That really is a key to leadership. How do you hold people accountable without undermining their desire to continue to improve? Every great coach understands how to do that. Every great teacher understands how to do that. every great military leader and CEO understands that you have to hold people accountable, but you don't have to destroy them in the process.
I'd like to switch gears just a second, Bill. One of the things about studying leadership is that sometimes I think we study too much just about how we lead. Every leader is, in fact, both a leader and a follower. I think you would agree with me. And that the Chancellor of the University of Texas has a board of trustees, the CEO has a board of directors, the teacher has a principal, and the principal has a superintendent, and we play two roles all the time. And good leadership has a lot to do with good followership. And I'm wondering, when you're hiring your management team, what do you expect from those that follow? Because it certainly isn't blind obedience.
Now, I would offer there's probably two aspects of this. You're exactly right. In order to be a good leader, you are going to have to be a good follower, because none of us are not accountable to somebody. I mean, everybody is accountable to somebody, whether it's personally or professionally. And you find that, I have found that the really good leaders understand how to be accountable to the men and women that are above them in a way that doesn't undermine the company they're working for. A lot of times the CEO or the board of directors or the board of the regents, may make a decision that you as the subordinate don't think was a good decision. Now you have kind of two choices. You can roll your eyes, you can slow roll them, you can try to undermine them because you don't agree with that, or you make your concerns known however you can, but then you've got, as we say in the military, you got to salute smartly and move out. The expectation that I always had from the men and women that worked for me was, feel free to challenge my decision and challenge my plan up to the point when we finally make the final decision. So, when I would have a meeting of my senior staff or the senior enlisted men, and I'd roll out a plan we were going to try to execute, I expected them, I demanded them to critique the plan, because I told them, look, if you think we're doing something wrong and you don't tell me, and then the plan fails because that part of the plan wasn't executed well, I'm going to hold you responsible. So if you think something's wrong, you better tell me. Now, at the end of the day, as the leader, it's going to be your decision to execute that plan one way or the other. But once you have made the decision, that's when I think it is important for the people to follow you to accept it as their own. It's hard to do. It's hard to do if you don't agree with the decision, but that's what good followership is about. Again, as the leader, as the CEO, as the commanding officer, you have to make sure that your staff feels like they truly have an opportunity and an expectation from the boss that they're going to critique them, that the boss has tough skin, that he wants to hear the truth spoken to him or her. But then again, once the decision is made, everybody needs to kind of get on board and move out. That's the way the units I've worked with and for work best.
I love the term you demanded that they do that. It's very difficult to speak truth to power. I mean,
it is. So what you have to do is you've got to set the conditions so that your staff understands that no kidding, you're not just saying that, you truly want to hear it. I took every opportunity I could when I was newly in command, and whether that was in the military or at the University of Texas system, to tease out a little bit of the staff members by, frankly, throwing something out there that I knew was probably, not in the best interests of the unit, and trying to find out who would say, I'm sorry, boss, that's really not a good idea. And then being able to say, well, you know what, you're right. I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. Let's shelve that for the time being. And when the staff and when the people that worked for you realized that you were approachable, that you were being sincere and wanting to know exactly, what ground truth was, then they were so much more willing to come to you. Because if you create an environment where the men and women that work for you are afraid to talk to you, are afraid to speak truth to power, boy, you will get yourself in a bind quickly. You will not know what's going on at the lower levels, and you are asking for trouble. If you create an environment where the men and women that work for you feel like they can speak to you in a way that is comfortable and confidential and respectful, boy, that's the mark of a great organization, I think, and a great leader.
You know, it's the first time since I was a young junior officer that I've heard a story like that, because I remember as a young junior grade lieutenant that I was with this admiral who had the dumbest idea ever in a meeting. And he was a really good guy and an interesting leader, and he spouted out to all the commanders of the ships. He would say, "What do you think of this idea?" And they went around the room going, "That's a great idea, Admiral. That's a great idea, Admiral. Boy, Admiral, that's a wonderful." And Dees Thompson was like, "That was the dumbest idea I'd ever thought of." And nobody disagreed until he called him on it. And from then on, he got some feedback.
Right.
But until he did that, it's the first time I'd heard something like that.
Well, the great thing, at least in the Navy, when you become a flag officer, you go to what we jokingly refer to as the baby flag officer course. You know, you're going to be a new 1-star. And the senior officers and both the active duty and the retired come in, and they tell you right up front, look, now that you're an admiral, you need to know a couple things. Everybody is going to laugh at your jokes, and people are not going to want to give you bad news or tell you that you're wrong. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, that's silly. You know, people aren't just going to laugh at every joke you have, and people are going to be, well, but they were exactly right. You know, for some reason, I never told a bad joke. But more to the point, I did find that, you know, your rank can be intimidating. And unless you have a certain amount of humility, unless you realize that there are folks below you that are genuinely smarter and more technically advanced than you are, probably have some better ideas than you do, you need to really tap into that expertise in order to make the command work well.
2 leaders, living or dead, who most influenced your thinking or you most admire?
Yeah, living or dead. Yeah, I have really been blessed in my military career to have worked for some, you know, remarkable leaders. Certainly, yeah, after 9/11, I was fortunate to work with Dave Petraeus and Stan McChrystal and Ray Odierno, Mike Mullen. I mean, some marvelous admirals and generals, and I learned from all of them. But kind of back to a little bit of a discussion about history. I do like history, and you know, as an American, the more you read about George Washington, the more you have to be impressed with his leadership style. You know, here was a man that was self-educated. You know, all of a sudden has got command of this relatively ragtag army against the British Redcoats, and his ability to not only inspire and motivate and lead under the most challenging of circumstances, you know, obviously turned us into the greatest nation, you know, in the history of the world, and really all because of one man. So you can't help, I think, but be impressed with Washington. And Washington, of course, had to deal with a pandemic as well. You know, there was smallpox at the time. Washington had his entire unit inoculated. A lot of guys died from that inoculation, but he knew that if smallpox spread throughout the Continental troops, that they would not be able to fight the British. So he took a very aggressive step and kind of forced these inoculations. Not well received, but the right thing to do at the right time. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Winston Churchill. Once again, a very eclectic fella. Obviously, some interesting habits, personal habits, but he was able to motivate the United Kingdom and all of his allies at a time when the world really needed it. In addition to being, like I said, one of the great orators, a remarkable writer. Of course, his History of the English-Speaking People stands as one of the great works in modern literature. Remarkable in every sense of the word.
So if you had just one piece of advice, so many good ones in our talk, but just one piece of advice for the Gen Z leader or the millennial leader who's coming up through the ranks, and you could give them one piece of advice that might shorten their trails, what would that be?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying I'm probably the biggest fan of the millennials and the Gen Z that you'll ever meet. And that surprises a lot of people. I know that there is this narrative out there that you know, the millennials and the Gen Zs are these entitled, you know, soft little snowflakes. Well, I will tell you, then you've never seen them in a firefight in Afghanistan, or you've never seen them trying to work their way through school in one of the University of Texas schools that I have. This is a remarkable generation of men and women. In many ways, I think better than the baby boomers. They are entrepreneurial. They are questioning. They are very loyal to their friends in a way that I haven't seen in a while. And they are prepared to mobilize when they feel some injustices out there. You may not agree with them, but I think you have to give them credit for being able to mobilize. I look at the horrendous shooting at Parkland and how those kids came together and marched on DC and marched on Tallahassee. Whether you agree with the politics of that or not, you can't help but I think be inspired by these kids coming together and doing things that I'm not sure my generation would have done. So I'm a huge fan of the millennials. But what I would tell all the millennial leaders is, as I would tell, frankly, any leader, leadership, I think, is fungible across generations. It's fungible across corporations and militaries and academia. Leadership is leadership. But a good leader listens. A good leader recognizes that they don't have all the answers. The first thing I was taught as a young ensign was go find the Master Chief Petty Officer of the command and sit down with him and find out what he has to say. So the Master Chief Petty Officer of the command was the senior enlisted guy at a SEAL team. And, I'm a young ensign. Listen to what the Master Chief has to say. And I took that advice at every command I went to at every level. This is about finding out what the men and women that work for you think. Listen to what they have to say. Be humble enough to understand that you don't have all the answers. Recognize that as a leader, if you ever think it's about you, if it's about your success, if it's about your ego, you're probably not going to be a very good leader. It's about doing the mission, getting the mission done, and giving the troops the resources to make that happen. And the only way you find out how to do it best is to listen to the rank and file or listen to somebody that can give you the best advice on that. So it's about listening.
Bill, the first time I heard your speech to the graduating class at Texas in 2014, when you told us all to make our bed, which everybody now thinks about it when they talk to you, I think, is that you left that day from your graduation and you were commissioned the same day, I think, right?
I was awful close. Yeah, it was. On the graduation, yes, I was commissioned the same day as my graduation ceremony. Yes.
And you knew you were going off to be a SEAL.
I did.
That takes an amount of courage for a 22-year-old. And when I look back in our conversations and your writings, whether it's buying the gates before you know where they're coming, speaking truth to power, ensuring that you have a plan for nearly everything, inspiring people with hope, all that takes an amount of courage. What I don't think people understand is that courage has to come from somewhere along the way. And I'm wondering, people don't know, I think, that you were a really good athlete as a young guy. And it's true, isn't it? You were a pretty good athlete. And I'm wondering if that athletic...
I was a pretty good athlete. Yeah, I could hold my own.
I wondered if that athletic experience prior to college might have affected that confidence that allowed you to do nothing short of amazing things in a lifetime.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm not sure whether the things I've done are any more amazing than thousands of people out there that I know. But I would offer that, we're all kind of a product of our experience. I was so very fortunate to have two great parents that instilled in me at a very young age, I think, the qualities that hopefully they would be proud that I held on to throughout my life. My father was a World War II fighter pilot. And so I grew up around men and women that were part of the greatest generation. And courage was just an expectation. They were courageous to go off to war. They were courageous when they came back and had to rebuild the country or build the country. This was a remarkable generation of men and women. And so I'm not sure I thought about what I was doing was courageous. It was just expected, and I was young and adventuresome, and it all kind of fell in place. But there are so many different types of courage. We always think of kind of the the martial courage to charge the hill or to run into a burning building or stop a madman with a gun. But the fact of the matter is, the courage to stand up for your convictions, I think, is has an equal place in the pantheon of heroes. And I have seen men and women who don't have near the physical qualities that most of my great SEALs do, that are equally, if not more, courageous because they stood by their convictions. So again, I was fortunate in life, and I was fortunate, frankly, to have been born in this country with a couple of great parents.
Tell me about just briefly about the athletic experience you had, because you told me once just how fast you were and how coaches might have helped you find the confidence to start down that track.
Yeah, I think fast is a relative term, Gary. So when I was in high school, I started off on the football team, but I was very small in high school. I was about 5'2". Didn't weigh very much my freshman and sophomore year. I started to grow a little bit by the end of my sophomore year, but I went from football to running track, and I became a miler. And in my junior and senior year, I was trying to break the school record in the mile, which at the time was 4 minutes and 32 seconds, 4 minutes, 32.7 seconds to be exact. I've told the story before, my second to my last race, my senior year, I went out and ran at the track meet, and it was abysmal. I think I ran a 4:37, so 5 seconds off the school record, which is an eternity in the mile. And so the next week, I worked out trying to get ready for my very last meet. I realized it was going to be the last chance I had to break the school record. And the night before my race, I got a phone call at home, and my dad answered the phone and said, "Hey, Bill, the coach is on the line for you." And I thought that was funny because I just left track and the coach hadn't mentioned anything to me. So I pick up the phone and answer the phone, and it was not my track coach. It was the assistant head football coach, a guy named Jerry Turnbow. And in the state of Texas and in a lot of towns around the nation, the football coaches, I mean, they're up there on Mount Olympus. I didn't even think Coach Turnbow knew who I was. And then all of a sudden he is calling me at home. And I was, taken aback, a little bit nervous. And he says, "Well, Bill, I understand you got your final meet tomorrow and you're trying to break the school record." And I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "Well, Bill, I know you can do this. You can do that. You can go out, you can break that record. You just have to run hard. You run hard and you'll break that record." And frankly, I was so inspired by the phone call that the coach would take the time to call me. The next day I went out and was able to break the record. And I told folks, nobody really cared about that record but me. And in fact, the next year it was broken by a faster kid than myself. But the fact that the coach called me and the fact that I was able to break that record gave me the confidence to go on and be a Navy SEAL. I knew that if I could set a goal for myself and achieve that goal, then there probably wasn't anything I couldn't do. And so you think about the fact that, not everybody's going to be able to, go on the mission to get bin Laden or rescue a Captain Phillips or capture a Saddam Hussein, but everybody will have the opportunity to inspire someone. Don't ever pass up that opportunity, because you never know, the cascading effect of a phone call or a pat on the back or a kind word here and there. And I've told Coach Turnbow, who I stay in contact with today, the effect he had on my life. And I like to think that I was able to help a lot of other young men and women along the way.
And we have a colleague that says there's greatness in all of us. Sometimes we're just never told that it's there, and we don't, and we begin not to believe it. But that leaders have an opportunity to help people reach toward their potential. And for most people, there's some place in life along the way that the switch goes on and we start to believe. Isn't that true for you too?
Of course. And again, it helps when you're very young. If your parents believe in you, if your friends believe in you, as you mentioned, I mean, I played a lot of sports growing up, and I was reasonably good. And that, of course, gives you confidence, but it doesn't have to be sports. You can be good in school. You can be good, behind the chessboard. You can be good anywhere. You have to, everybody has a talent. Sometimes you just have to find that talent, make the most of it. And then if people encourage you along the way and you get confidence, you kind of become unstoppable in terms of what you can get done.
That's very interesting. A colleague of ours is was one of Arnold Palmer's proteges. And he said he asked Mr. Palmer one day before he died if he had one piece of advice to give his son going forward, what would it be about golf? And Arnold said that he'd get up every day and tell his son that he could play.
Yeah.
Every day he would get up and say, you can play. And that sometimes it just takes a person believing in you. And I thank you. And I can't imagine how many people you've done that for in your career, Bill. Yeah. Bill, thank you for taking your time today. I am an outrageous fan. I find every time we talk, I should be taking notes. So I want to thank you for your time. And I'd like to thank the Washington Speakers Bureau for providing us with the opportunity. Both you and I have had a long association with Washington Speakers Bureau, with Harry Rose and Christine Farrell on their team. And I'd like to thank them for all the things they've done for us.
Well, Gary, thank you very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed today, and to your point, Harry and Christine have just been fabulous to me, and I've really enjoyed my time working with Washington Speakers Bureau, and this has been a great session today, so thanks.
Thanks, Bill. See you soon.
All right, take care.